funeral is structured to be the one moment everybody finally agrees to soften the truth. The flowers, the open casket, the prepared eulogy, the murmured kindnesses about a complicated person. Then somebody opens the casket, and it's the wrong man. Or a mistress arrives in mourning clothes. Or the obituary itself names every family secret in newsprint. 25 times the receipts spoke louder than the eulogy, and the mourners are still whispering about what happened. 1. 29 years longer than expected, and much longer than he deserved. That was the first line of the obituary the Carnes Funeral Home in Galveston, Texas, posted in early 2017 for Leslie Ray Popeye Charping. His daughter Sheila Smith wrote it. She listed his hobbies: abuse, drinking, womanizing, expediting trips to heaven for the family pets, and noted his remains would sit in the barn until the family donkey's wood shavings ran out. No prayers, no apologies, no service. Speaking later to a Houston radio show, Sheila said her father had hated liars, and a sanitized obituary would have been the bigger insult. Strangers across the country mailed her notes about the parents they would also not be eulogizing. The funeral home website became the receipt for 60 years of damage. 2. Behind a crematory in the wooded community of Noble, Georgia, a propane delivery worker spotted what he thought was a human bone in February 2002. By the time investigators finished cataloging the property, the count had reached 339 uncremated bodies, scattered across the grounds, stuffed into vehicles, dumped in a nearby lake. Operator Ray Brent Marsh had been accepting bodies from funeral homes across Georgia, Alabama, and Tennessee for years, and handing families bags of cement dust and wood chips instead of ashes. A federal disaster team trucked in a portable morgue from Maryland. Marsh later pleaded guilty to 787 counts, including theft, abuse of a corpse, and burial service fraud. The funeral homes that had used Tri-State settled the class action for $36 million. The ashes families had spread had never been their relatives at all. 3. 2 adult children sat down in 2018 and decided their mother's death notice would not lie. The Redwood Falls Gazette in Minnesota ran their words for 80-year-old Kathleen Dimlow exactly as submitted. The obituary opened normally: birth, marriage, 2 children, then turned. In 1962, she had become pregnant by her husband's brother Lyle, moved to California, and abandoned Gina and Jay to be raised by their grandparents. The closing line read that this world was a better place without her. Within a week, the obituary had been republished worldwide. Some relatives publicly disputed it. The newspaper kept it up. For 5 decades, the family had been politely managing a story everyone already knew. The death notice ended that arrangement permanently. 4. Hours before the burial, daughter Kumi Kim told the funeral director the woman in the casket did not look like her 93-year-old mother. The director responded in court filings with a clear expression of denial and dismissed her concerns about post-death changes. Kumi rationalized that maybe embalming, makeup, or filler explained it. Then the casket was lowered at Promise Church in Leonia, New Jersey, and almost immediately raised again. The body inside was a stranger about 20 years younger, with her own teeth. Kyung-ja Kim's dentures had been placed under the wrong woman's pillow. Her clothes had been used to dress someone else. The family held a makeshift funeral the next day, missing the church mass that had been her final wish, and sued for $50 million. 5. Tucked at the end of an otherwise standard military obituary in the Albany Times-Union, after the citations and the conspicuous service medal, was a line that read, "I must tell you one more thing." The deceased, Colonel Edward Thomas Ryan, was 85. He had asked his niece to make sure the message ran. He had been gay his whole life, through grade school, high school, college, the Army, his decades of public service in upstate New York. He had loved a man named Paul Cavagnaro for 25 years. Paul had died in 1994 from a medical procedure gone wrong. Ryan apologized in newsprint for never having had the courage to come out and asked to be buried beside Paul. The obituary went viral over Pride Month 2024. He got the salute he never asked for in life. 6. Federal prison sentences for 6 men. $450 million in losses. 97,000 victims across more than 16 states, many of them elderly, many already buried by the time investigators put the case together. James Doug Cassidy's Missouri company, National Prearranged Services, had spent 16 years selling prepaid funeral contracts the way an honest business would, then doing the opposite with the money. Customer payments were routed into risky investments and personal enrichment. Application documents were brazenly altered. Whole life policies were converted to term. NPS even purchased other funeral homes' prepaid contracts and lied to those funeral directors about how the money would be held. State regulators were lied to routinely. By the time the FBI unwound it, the only thing those families had bought in advance was the discovery that nothing had been set aside at all. 7. One woman walked up to the open coffin and said, "Love, I'm going to miss you." Another woman, already standing nearby, demanded to know who she was. Both, it turned out, had been dating the deceased. The wake, held in Mexico, captured on phones, spread across Instagram, collapsed into a fight over the casket. They grappled across the funeral lilies. The lid nearly came off. A person dressed in black tried to pull them apart, while other mourners shielded the body. Municipal police arrived after enough neighbors called in the disturbance during the service. The deceased, who could no longer answer the question of whose he was, lay between them. Two relationships that had been kept separate his entire life met at the same coffin within 10 minutes of each other. Whatever he had told them was now permanent record. 8. Black smoke pouring from an Oscar ceramics plant in Hesperia, California in January 1987. A caller told the assistant fire chief, "Don't tell me they're not burning bodies. I was at the ovens at Auschwitz." Investigators walked into several hundred pounds of human remains. The trail led to Lamb Funeral Home in Pasadena, a respected family business since 1929, and to David Sconce, who had grown the family's annual cremations from 194 to over 8,000 by packing bodies into ovens on 16-hour shifts. Employees called him Little Hitler. Gold teeth had been pried from corpses. Brains, corneas, bones, and tendons were sold through a fictional Coastal International Eye and Tissue Bank. 16,000 families joined the class action. The case settled for $15.5 million. Pause for the same shape across all 8 cases. Somebody, a daughter, a propane driver, a fire chief, a stranger looking at the wrong face in a casket, opens a door, and the carefully held narrative behind that door does not survive contact with documentation. The next stretch is what happens when the receipts come from inside the funeral itself. 9. A plus-size Jewish lady redneck died in El Paso on Saturday. That was the opening line of the December 2021 obituary Andy Coren wrote for his 84-year-old mother, Renee Mandel Coren, in the Fayetteville Observer. He kept going. She had bowled, gambled, gone bankrupt in multiple states, raised 6 children largely from poverty, and possessed what her son called a very busy middle finger. She had married briefly, divorced loudly, and read her dirty magazines, allegedly, for the articles. The funeral was a non-denominational gathering at her favorite bowling alley. The family's request? Absolutely zero privacy or propriety, and that mourners go spend government money at a blackjack table in her honor. The obituary went international within 48 hours. The receipts on this one were affectionate, but they were still receipts. The eulogy refused to flatter. 10. After the funeral arrangements were made for 102-year-old Laura Wood at the Autumn Green Funeral Home in Alfred, Maine, her daughter, Sally Wood, went looking for her mother's wedding and engagement rings. 3 rings fused together, appraised years earlier at around $4,000. They were gone. The rings turned up at a local pawn shop. The seller, traced through the shop's records, was Stuart Weston, the funeral home worker who had been called to Seal Rock Healthcare on January 21, 2021, to help with arrangements. Wood's daughter told reporters it wasn't the money, it was her mother and father in that ring. Weston was fired, charged with felony theft, and sentenced in February 2022 to 3 months at York County Jail. The pawn ticket itself was the receipt that survived him longer than the funeral did. 11. The facial hair was wrong. That's what daughter Stacy Holzman noticed first when she looked at the man in the casket who was supposed to be her 72-year-old father, Clifford Zahner. Then she saw an autopsy scar across his forehead, except no autopsy had been ordered. The funeral director told her shaving was standard practice and that hospital deaths often involve incisions. Neither was true. Zahner had died of heart failure in South Carolina. His body was supposed to be shipped to Long Island and buried in the family plot. The wrong man had been sent in his place and dressed in Zahner's favorite clothes. The family filed a $60 million lawsuit against both funeral homes. The receipt this time was a stranger's body wearing the family's ironed shirt. 12. Pastor John Paul Miller of Solid Rock at Market Common stood at the pulpit during his wife Micah's memorial service in May 2024 and told the congregation he had tried to raise her from the dead. Micah was 30. The Robeson County, North Carolina Sheriff's Office had ruled her death a suicide. What was already known publicly and verified through court filings was that Micah had filed for divorce from John Paul weeks before. The bizarre service was filmed and uploaded to the church's YouTube channel by a videographer who later said he had acted before official approval. The video disappeared from the church account, but had already been mirrored across social media. The eulogy and the docketed divorce paperwork were now on the same internet, telling 2 different stories about the same marriage. 13. After neighbors in Penrose, Colorado complained about a foul smell coming from a building south of Colorado Springs, investigators in October 2023 walked into a bug-infested facility and counted nearly 190 decomposing bodies. Owners John and Carrie Halford of Return to Nature Funeral Home had been giving grieving families bags of fake ashes for years. Federal prosecutors traced the spending: a GMC Yukon, laser body sculpting, jewelry, vacations, cryptocurrency. The couple had also defrauded roughly $900,000 in COVID-19 relief aid. John was sentenced to 20 years in federal prison and 40 years in state court for 191 counts of corpse abuse. Carrie received 30 years. Families who had spread what they thought were their relatives realized they had spread something else entirely. The receipts had been with the Halfords' bank statements all along. 14. Funeral home director Philip Petrus of Connecticut decided that his clients' prepaid funeral funds, money set aside, often by elderly customers to spare their families a final bill, would work better as gambling money. Investigators found he had taken from at least 128 clients. The money went to casinos and trips. When the case prompted state legislators to look at how Connecticut regulated this kind of contract, they discovered something more uncomfortable. No state agency formally oversaw prepaid funeral contracts at all. Several agencies handled different fragments. State Representative Tammy Nuccio drafted $1 million funeral fraud victim compensation fund, paying victims up to $10,000 each, alongside a working group to figure out actual oversight. The receipt here was the absence of any. 15. License revoked immediately on grounds of immediate and significant danger to public health, safety, and welfare. That was the order Utah's Division of Occupational and Professional Licensing issued in November 2017 against Carver Mortuary in Salt Lake City and its directors Tanner Carver and Shane Westmoreland. The state had compiled testimony from former employees alleging staff were instructed to take watches, rings, and other personal property from bodies retrieved at hospitals, nursing homes, and other funeral establishments, items that were then kept rather than returned to families. State investigators also documented a high risk that bodies and cremated remains had been misidentified due to the lack of basic record-keeping. The mortuary's licenses for cremation services had covered Intermountain Medical Center, the state medical examiner's office, and Salt Lake County itself. The receipt was the order revoking the license. 16. Standing among the mourners at her father-in-law's funeral in Shandong, China in June 2022, a woman surnamed Shang noticed someone she did not recognize, dressed in mourning attire, weeping by the coffin, introducing herself as daughter-in-law. Shang, who had been married to the late man's son for 19 years, had never seen her before. Her father-in-law's funeral roster, in effect, had become the document she had been missing. When she pressed her husband afterward, his answers were evasive enough to push her into court. The proceedings established a 16-year affair, conducted in parallel with the marriage, including a son she had never been told about. The other woman had simply, finally, shown up where she felt entitled to grieve. The mourning clothes were the receipt. The marriage was already over by the time the coffin closed. There is a kind of trust the funeral industry runs on, that the body in the casket is the right body, that the ashes are the right ashes, that the woman crying is who she says she is. Each of these cases is what happens when one of those small assumptions is checked against a piece of paper, a website, a courthouse filing, or a photograph. The polite version stops being the official version. 17. The funeral home insisted the body in the room was their father. The family knew it wasn't. 93-year-old Roland Johnson Sr., DuPont chef for 3 decades, father of 8, grandfather of 14, great-grandfather of 52, had been promised a traditional burial in Wilmington, Delaware. At the viewing in 2024, his daughter Darla Chase saw a stranger and was told the suit she had brought had been swapped, that the misshape was makeup, that her father's tattoo couldn't be checked in time. The family stepped outside, opened a phone, and pulled up Bell Funeral Home's own website, where a photograph of the man actually in their viewing room sat above someone else's obituary. He had been cremated weeks earlier. Their father had been cremated too, against his wishes. The funeral home's own page was the receipt the staff couldn't talk over. 18. A few paragraphs in the Florida Times-Union obituary section in 2024 listed survivors of an 81-year-old former NYPD officer this way. 3 children. No, 4. Oops, 5 children. Well, as of 2022, we believe there is one more that we know about, but there could be more. The author was the deceased son, Larry Paff, Jr. He had spent months drafting it before submitting it after his half-brother delivered news of their father's death. The obituary noted the man's commanding officer had once swapped his service weapon and badge for a broom while he tried to dry out. It noted decades of abandonment, an abusive first marriage, several siblings whose existence had been confirmed by DNA testing. Larry told the paper that publishing it was the closest thing to closure he expected. The newspaper printed it anyway. 19. 20 years for Megan Hess. 15 years for her mother, Shirley Kutch. Those were the federal sentences handed down in January 2023 for 2 Colorado funeral home operators in Montrose who had spent years selling bodies and body parts to broker services without any of the family's consent. Each had pleaded guilty to mail fraud and aiding and abetting. Sunset Mesa funeral directors had taken bodies promised cremation and dismembered them for resale. The families received fake ashes and assumed everything was as it appeared. Investigators traced the body broker shipments. The receipts were literal. invoices, packing slips, bank deposits. The acting FBI special agent in Denver said the women had preyed on vulnerable victims who turned to them in a time of grief. Hundreds of families spent years processing what they had actually buried. 20. Faced with the prospect of voting for either Donald Trump or Hillary Clinton, Mary Ann Noland of Richmond chose instead to pass into the eternal love of God on Sunday, May 15, 2016, at the age of 68. That was the opening line her family ran in the Richmond Times-Dispatch death notice. Mary Ann had been a graduate of Douglas Freeman High School and the University of Virginia School of Nursing, a faithful churchgoer, a wife and grandmother of 10. The rest of the obituary was tender and conventional. The first line, however, was the line. It was reprinted from Richmond to Reno, treated as both a joke and a quiet political document of its moment. The funeral home, Joseph W. Bliley, ran it without edits. The receipt was an election year so exhausting it ended up in a permanent record. 21. A lawsuit filed against a Catholic priest, his parish, and the Archdiocese of Detroit. That was the family's response in 2019 after Reverend Don LaQuesta delivered the funeral homily for 18-year-old Mason Hullebarger at Our Lady of Mount Carmel Church in Temperance, Michigan. The Hullebarger family had specifically asked that Mason's manner of death, by suicide, be treated privately, kept among close friends and relatives. LaQuesta instead used the homily to argue, before grieving classmates and parishioners, that Mason's death was against God and to imply uncertainty about his eternal fate. The Archdiocese later restricted his preaching at funerals and required his homilies to be reviewed in advance. The family alleged intentional infliction of emotional distress. The receipt this time was the request the family had made before the service, in writing, that the pulpit ignored. 22. After a graveside funeral in Providence, Rhode Island in early 2026, the family of 75-year-old Amelia Severino, who had died on December 30, 2025, from injuries in a Christmas Day fire, went home thinking they had buried their mother. They had not. Rhode Island Hospital's morgue had released the wrong body to Bell Funeral Home on January 15th. The funeral home, according to the lawsuit, never opened the bag. The clothes the family had bought were dropped on top of the sealed body bag and lowered with it. The error came to light when a different funeral home arrived to collect that body, and the hospital had to ask for it back. Severino's actual remains were located, identified by her family, and reburied in the same casket. The hospital fired the responsible employee. The receipt was a body bag opened too late. 3 more cases now, and a step back. The pattern across these stories is not really about a single bad funeral home or a single bitter child. It's that mourning is supposed to be the moment everyone agrees to look the other way, and a surprising number of people, adult children, attorneys, building inspectors, propane drivers, neighbors with phones, Supreme Court justices, keep refusing to. The receipts are not always paperwork. Sometimes they are signage. Sometimes they are skid marks across a cemetery lawn. 23. A brother and sister, attending their mother's funeral at Rolling Hills Memorial Park in Richmond, California in August 2022, started arguing in front of the gravesite. The sister's boyfriend tried to walk her away. The brother went after the boyfriend instead. A relative hit the brother in the head with a cane. The brother got into his vehicle and drove it across the cemetery. Over grass, over headstones, over a buried water main he ruptured on the way, trying to run over his sister. He missed her. He hit a 33-year-old female relative who went to the hospital with non-life-threatening injuries. The casket of the woman they had come to bury was knocked over in the process. The body, mercifully, did not fall out. Damage estimate, roughly $20,000. The flooded plot belonged to the funeral director's grandmother. 24. She is survived by her 6 of 8 children, whom she spent her lifetime torturing in every way possible. That sentence ran in the Reno Gazette-Journal in September 2013 in the paid obituary for Mary Ann Teresa Johnson Reddick, who had died alone at 78. Her surviving children continued. She had refused to let anyone show compassion to them as small children, and as adults she had stalked and tortured anyone they tried to love. They closed by saying their lifelong nightmare finally had some form of closure. The newspaper pulled the obituary from its website within 24 hours. By then, Gawker and other outlets had archived it. One of the children later wrote publicly that publishing the obit had been a deliberate choice to break the silence society normally extends to abusers in death. The Reno paper had simply been the printing press. 25. On one side, a father burying his 20-year-old Marine son killed in Iraq. On the other, a Kansas church holding picket signs that read, "Thank God for dead soldiers." That was the collision at Lance Corporal Matthew Snyder's funeral in Westminster, Maryland, in March 2006. Albert Snyder sued Westboro Baptist Church for intentional infliction of emotional distress, and a Maryland jury awarded him nearly $11 million. In 2011, the United States Supreme Court ruled 8-1 for Westboro. The picketing had been on public land, addressed matters of public concern, and was protected by the First Amendment. Justice Alito's lone dissent called the conduct a malevolent verbal attack on a grieving family. The receipt on this one was a court opinion that protected, by name, the very people the Snyders had asked to leave their son's funeral alone. What threads through all 25 of these is not really cruelty or even greed, though there was plenty of both. It's a category mismatch. A funeral is built around omission, the kind, gentle thing to say, the line drawn under a complicated life, the polite consensus that this is not the moment for the full story. The receipts don't honor that consensus. The lawsuits don't. The license records don't. The obituary, written in someone's own kitchen by an adult who has spent 40 years rehearsing it, doesn't. And neither does the woman in mourning clothes who is not, technically, supposed to be there. So the public version of who someone was and the documented version of what was actually happening end up filed at the same address. Whew, sometimes that's a relief. Sometimes it's a class action. Sometimes it's a Supreme Court decision the grieving family has to read with their morning coffee. The mourners whisper for a reason. Every funeral is a draft, and somebody else is always holding the final edits. If you want more cases where the paperwork outlasted the eulogy, subscribe before the next one arrives. Death is rarely the end of a story. Most of the time, it's the moment the file finally opens.